All right, well, let's just jump into this next. This is a real short little paradigm shift, but I think it's one that's really important for the folks, most of the people in our congregations, just talking about cultural shifts. So some really good writing on this. If this kind of floats your boat or if this interests you, probably the author that writes on this the best is an Anabaptist guy named Stuart Murray. He's written probably 3 different books on the Christendom. One of them is called Church After Christendom. It's extremely helpful. He just talks about what really helps us understand what is Christendom and then what do we mean by post-Christendom. So these first 2 slides, this actually comes from one of Murray's books where he's talking about what he calls ecclesiastical shifts, that when we've shifted from Christendom to post-Christendom, we've shifted from this to this. So we won't read all of these, but I want to give you just a little background, and then I want to show you an image that is in the yellow book, Missional Quest, that it seems like has been really helpful for people to kind of understand this shift. So Murray says one of the shifts is the church has moved from the center to the margins. So does that make sense? In Christendom, we had home field advantage. We don't have home field advantage anymore. We've been relegated to the margins. There's a shift from being the majority to the minority. There's been a shift from being settlers to now we really need to see ourselves more as sojourners. There's a shift from being a place of power and privilege to now it's plurality. We're one of many ideologies, in the minds of a lot of people. Does that make sense? From control to witness, from maintenance to mission, and from institution to movement. So Murray, a whole book just about these 7 ecclesiastical shifts that's helpful for us, important for us to understand. Well, here's an image that for me helps to kind of summarize all of this. So let me explain this. Those are usually circles. The projector makes them look like they're ovals right now, but that won't mess it. It's all the same. So here's the point. So pre-Christendom, if you've never, if you've heard that word Christendom, you wonder where it comes from. Well, it's because the Roman emperor, and so let me back up a minute. If you go all the way back in church history, the Roman Empire, there was a lot of persecution on Christians. But the persecution kind of came in ebb and flows, and also it wasn't always empire-wide. But there was one particular Roman emperor by the name of Diocletian. It was the worst. It was empire-wide, and Diocletian wanted to try to eliminate Christianity. So persecution under Diocletian was at an all-time high. Well, the emperor after Diocletian was a guy named Constantine. Well, in 312, 313 AD, Constantine had a conversion experience. Now, a lot of historians, they question his conversion, and rightfully so, I think. But the point is, he ended religious persecution. So in 313, he passed this law that's called the Edict of Milan, and it ended religious persecution. Now, sometimes you'll hear people say that Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Technically speaking, that's not true. It was the following emperor by the name of Theodosius that did that. But the point is, Constantine ended religious persecution. That's a good thing, of course, right? Well, before Constantine, the dominant seat of culture, or here I call it the prevailing influence of a culture, the dominant seat of culture was the Roman Empire. It was in the place of power and privilege. It was the thing that the Roman Empire influenced everything, right? And the church, that's what this plus sign is supposed to represent. It should be a cross, but that represents the early church. So the point is, the early church was relegated to the margins. The early church was really a marginalized sect, S-E-C-T, out here on the margins. But what's cool is we know from Paul's letters, we know from early church history that even though it was relegated to the margins, it was a fringe group, it was having major inroads into the dominant seat of culture. So even though it was this little tiny group out here, it was really having significant influence on the dominant seat of culture. Make sense? So then, right here, if there was a dotted line, this would be AD 13 or AD 12 with the Edict of Milan. So when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, Christendom was the wedding of the Roman Empire, the government, and the church together. So the church, in a very perverted kind of way, became the dominant seat of culture. But it was the Christendom model. So the reality is the church went from being this marginalized sect, really this rapidly growing movement, to being an institutional organization. So it was really good that religious persecution ended, but in a sense, this right here was kind of the beginning of the end, because the church was just instantly flooded with influence, with power, with money. Constantine built giant buildings. So it went from being this organic movement to being this thing that was institutionalized in time and space. Does that make sense? So then I would say, no one knows, like there wasn't a year this happened, but somewhere in the mid-21st century or the 20th century, Christendom began to crumble. And I would argue today there really isn't one dominant seat of culture. It's really multiple ideologies. But here's the point of the image, is that the church has once again been relegated to the margins. Now, for some of us, you might think that's a bad thing. and a lot of times when people think that's a bad thing, they want to return to this. It's like, we need to win the culture back, right? We need to get back to the way it was. I actually think it's a good thing, because no longer do we operate from a place of power and privilege, but we should be operating from the posture of a servant. And the reality is, if we really operate like this, we could still make major inroads in the dominant seats of culture. So I love Reggie McNeil. He gives a talk a long time ago, it's probably 10 years ago, kind of gives a talk on this whole Christendom, post-Christendom shift, and the title of his talk is It's AD 30 All Over Again. I love that. It's AD 30 all over again. And once again, I think it's actually a good thing, not a bad thing. But what it means is we have to recapture the ways of Jesus, that our Christology has to inform our missiology, which needs to inform our ecclesiology. So let me just cut to this, just for the sake of time. So here's one other way that I like to frame all of this that we're doing today, is to say that, as I just said this, that our Christology, the ways, it's the person, work, and ways of Jesus, needs to influence our missiology, which is mission. It's the way we connect and relate with people, and then that should influence or determine our ecclesiology. So in other words, it's Jesus, mission, and church. But too often, I think in evangelical circles, and especially in church planting, we do it backwards. So, we go visit another church, or we go to a conference about a church that's doing such and such, and unfortunately, we start with ecclesiology instead of Christology. So I think part of kind of the answer in all this stuff that we're talking about is it has to start with the person of Jesus. It has to start with the person, work, and I like to say the ways of Jesus. That in a sense, we need to be re-Jesused. So that little line up above, we constantly have to be recalibrating back to the ways of Jesus. So then the way I like to use this also is then to kind of use this as a framework for what we've talked about so far, but really what we're going to talk about this afternoon. So Christology, and I've already kind of alluded to this morning, I think we need a bigger, more robust, comprehensive Christology that includes all of that. Remember this morning I said incarnation, the teachings and ways of Jesus, the life of Jesus. It is the cross, it's the resurrection, it's the ascension, it's Pentecost, the Spirit empowering the church, it's the second coming. All of that is Christology. And we need to even kind of broaden our understanding of the gospel. That the gospel isn't just the 4 points, but the gospel is more robust as well. And then that needs to inform our missiology. So then our missiology will involve conversations around post-Christendom shift. It'll involve conversations around place, and that's what we're going to do next. We're going to talk about our first, second, and third places. It's going to involve conversations around our neighborhood. It's going to involve conversations around discipleship and evangelism. I mean, how would discipleship and evangelism be different if it's really informed by a robust Christology? And then eventually that should inform the way we understand the church. I don't know if you can read these words, but the church needs to be adaptive. What I mean by that, I love this little phrase from Alan Hirsch's book, Permanent Revolution. He says, mission is the mother of adaptive ecclesiology. Now that sounds like big language, but think about that for a second. Mission is the mother of adaptive ecclesiology. In other words, as we allow a robust Christology to inform our missiology, there should be lots of wild and wonderful expressions of church. So instead of starting with church, and we only have one frame of reference and kind of this cookie cutter what church looks like, mission should be the mother of adaptive ecclesiology. There should be lots of different expressions of church. And then activate, what I mean by that is that if we really do this, I think we'll understand that in all of this, we have to activate all the people of God. It's not just the paid professionals. It's not one gender or another. It's not how much money you have or what color your skin. We activate all the people of God. And then the last one, fivefold. We probably won't have time to talk about this today, but I've become increasingly convinced, really from Alan's writing and influence about APEST. So Ephesians 4, I don't know if you're familiar with apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher, that there's a fivefold. That passage in Ephesians 4 says that those are gifts given to the church. But too often we think about it as a leadership text. It's not a leadership text. Paul says those gifts have been given to the body. And then he says the body isn't mature if all of those gifts are not used. But what we have done, especially in a Christendom model, is we've allowed the gifts of just shepherd teacher to form our ecclesiology. And we've relegated the APE. Sometimes people call them the APEs, but it's the apostle, prophet, evangelist. Does that make sense? I mean, when we think of church, if you think of those fivefold giftings, when we think of church, what are the two that dominate? Yeah, it's pastor, teacher, right? Now, I'm not saying, we don't want to minimize that at all. We just want to elevate the other three at the same time, that we need all of those. So later, if we have a chance, if you're interested in that at all, yeah, Permanent Revolution is a book that is extremely helpful. And then I'd be happy to send you, I've actually have about a 6-page kind of summary of that whole book that just kind of cuts to the core of the whole APEST. I'd be happy to send that to you if you're interested. Just shoot me an email. So that's really, some of this is kind of heavy. Let me just pause there for a minute before we get into the practical. Anything from all of that